Britain doesn't pretend its special forces don't exist. It just refuses to talk about what they do. No mission names, no timelines, no confirmation, even decades later. Wars end, governments change, files stay shut. That silence isn't about secrecy for its own sake. It's about control, legal, political, diplomatic. Some operations work too well, involve too many partners, or cross lines no one wants reopened in public. Other countries eventually tell these stories. Britain does not. And when a nation maintains that kind of silence for this long, it usually isn't hiding failure. It's protecting something that still matters. When people say British Special Forces, they usually mean one unit, sometimes two. Occasionally they just say the SAS and move on. That shorthand is convenient and mostly wrong. What actually exists is a deliberately opaque structure grouped under UK Special Forces, a command arrangement designed less to advertise capability and more to manage deniability. Unlike the American system, which eventually names units, publishes command charts, and retroactively declassifies operations, the British model is built to avoid leaving a paper trail in the first place. At the most recognizable level sits the Special Air Service, formed during the Second World War and later reshaped around counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. Parallel to it is the Special Boat Service, originally focused on maritime operation, but long since expanded into land-based missions indistinguishable from its counterpart in all but name. Less publicly discussed, but no less important, is the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, whose role is not raids or hostage rescue, but long-term surveillance, intelligence collection, and target development. Its existence is acknowledged, its activities rarely are. What matters is not the individual units, but how they are used. British Special Forces are not structured around persistent overseas deployments in the way U.S. Special Operations Forces are. They are rotated, seconded, attached, or embedded in ways that intentionally blur whether they are present at all. Personnel may appear on paper as trainers, advisors, or liaison officers while performing tasks that are operational in every meaningful sense. This structure serves several purposes at once. First, it protects political leadership. If an operation succeeds, silence costs nothing. If something goes wrong, ambiguity buys time and limits accountability. Parliament cannot question what the government will not acknowledge, and ministers cannot be forced to explain missions that officially never occurred. Second, it protects relationships. British intelligence and special operations are deeply intertwined with foreign partners, often in arrangements that predate the conflict in question. Public acknowledgement risks exposing not just British actions, but the involvement or tolerance of other governments that prefer not to be named. Third, it protects continuity. Methods used by British Special Forces tend to persist for decades. Surveillance techniques, recruitment pipelines, and liaison networks are not discarded simply because a war ends. Public disclosure doesn't just explain the past, it compromises the present. This is why British secrecy feels different from American secrecy. In the US system, classification is often treated as temporary embarrassment management. In the British system, it is treated as operational hygiene. Another key difference is how anonymity is enforced. Members of the British Special Forces are legally protected from identification, and that protection is taken seriously. Court proceedings, inquests, and official reports routinely avoid naming units or individuals, even when their involvement is obvious to anyone familiar with the context. This is not about hero worship. In fact, it works against it. There are no official unit narratives released to shape public perception, no after-action press briefings, no sanctioned myth-making. The result is a strange inversion. Some of the most active special operations forces in the world leave behind some of the least visible histories. That absence often gets filled by speculation, books written at arm's length, or exaggerated popular culture portrayals. But the real story is more restrained and more deliberate. British Special Forces are not designed to be invisible because they are rare. They are invisible because they are used often enough that visibility would become a liability. Understanding that structure is essential before discussing anything else. Because when Britain refuses to talk about specific operations, it isn't improvising secrecy after the fact. It is operating exactly as the system was built to operate. Plausible deniability sounds like a legal phrase, but in British military practice, it functions more like a tool, used deliberately, repeatedly, and with a clear purpose. It's not about fooling adversaries, it's about managing consequences. At its core, plausible deniability allows the British government to operate in the space between acknowledgement and denial. Not, this didn't happen, but we are not commenting. That distinction matters. A denial can be challenged. Silence cannot. This approach developed long before modern counterterrorism or the post-Cold War security environment. Britain's experience with imperial policing, insurgency, and intelligence-led conflict taught a simple lesson early on. Once a government publicly owns an action, it also owns the fallout. Legal challenges, diplomatic retaliation, domestic political pressure, all of it becomes unavoidable. Silence, by contrast, limits the surface area of exposure. For British Special Forces, this doctrine shapes how operations are authorized, executed, and remembered. Unlike systems that rely on post-operation disclosure to control the narrative, British planners assume that many actions will never be publicly discussed at all. That assumption influences everything from paperwork to command relationships. Missions are structured so that responsibility is diffuse, documentation is minimal, and outcomes are framed in ways that can be absorbed quietly by existing intelligence channels rather than public statements. This creates what can best be described as non-events. A non-event is something that clearly occurred. Troops moved, people were detained or extracted, weapons were seized, violence may have been used, but which never enters the public historical record in a clean, traceable way. There is no press release, no official citation, no anniversary. The incident exists only indirectly, through diplomatic cables, intelligence assessments, or the occasional court filing that references actions without naming actors. Non-events are not accidents, they are the intended product. This is why British Special Forces rarely appear at the center of official narratives, even in conflicts where their involvement is widely assumed. When an operation succeeds quietly, the political benefit lies in its invisibility. When it fails or produces unintended consequences, the lack of acknowledgement limits the damage. The doctrine also protects allies. British operations frequently occur in cooperation with foreign governments that face their own internal constraints. Public confirmation of outside involvement can destabilize partner regimes, expose intelligence services, or inflame domestic opposition. Silence allows those governments to maintain their own plausible deniability while still benefiting from British capabilities. Journalists are deflected. Parliamentary questions are answered with formulaic language. Courts are encouraged, sometimes required, to redact details that would normally be part of the public record. Even decades later, the default position remains unchanged. No confirmation, no denial, no elaboration. Once an operation is officially acknowledged, it becomes precedent. Future governments can be pressed to explain similar actions, justify authorities, or release comparable files. By refusing to set that precedent, Britain preserves flexibility. There is also a cultural component. British Special Forces operate under an institutional expectation that anonymity is permanent. Unlike systems that reward public recognition after service, the British model reinforces the idea that contribution ends with the mission, not with a memoir or a medal ceremony. Recognition exists internally, not publicly. That culture reinforces discipline. It discourages leaks. It also limits the temptation to retroactively frame actions as more dramatic, more dangerous, or more decisive than they actually were. The result is a body of activity that is simultaneously extensive and difficult to map. Patterns can be inferred, regions where British interests are concentrated, moments where quiet intervention aligns with sudden stability, but details remain stubbornly out of reach. This is not because the information has been lost. It is because, from the beginning, it was never meant to be found. Understanding plausible deniability as a weapon, not a shield, explains why so much of British Special Forces history exists only at the edge of other stories. It is not hidden because it is shameful. It is hidden because exposure would reduce its usefulness. And in this system, usefulness always outweighs recognition. Some British Special Forces operations are not classified in the traditional sense. They are not stamped secret and locked away pending a future release date. Instead, they exist in fragments, referenced obliquely, acknowledged indirectly, or revealed only as a consequence of something else going wrong. These are the operations that exist sideways. They appear in court transcripts where the facts of a case require acknowledging that military personnel were present without specifying who they were or why. They suffice in diplomatic reporting that describes an outcome but omits the mechanism. They are hinted at in memoirs that carefully describe preparation, tension, and aftermath while skipping the action itself. British officials rarely say an operation did not happen. They simply decline to provide the connective tissue that would allow anyone to reconstruct it. This is most visible in three broad categories. The first is extraction. Not dramatic hostage rescues with helicopters and gunfire, but quiet removals of individuals whose continued presence poses political, legal, or security risks. These operations are often conducted under diplomatic cover, sometimes with the consent of the host government, sometimes in legal gray zones where consent is implied rather than recorded. When successful, these extractions leave almost no public trace. The individual disappears from one environment and reappears in another, often under a different legal status. Any involvement by British forces is absorbed into bureaucratic language, assisted departure, transfer of custody, or security facilitation. The second category is stabilization support. British Special Forces have long operated in roles that blur the line between advising and acting. A unit may be officially present to train local forces, assess security conditions, or coordinate intelligence. But when a situation deteriorates quickly, those same personnel may become the only capable force on the ground. In these cases, British involvement is rarely acknowledged because doing so would require admitting that advisory missions can and do become operational without a formal change in mandate. That admission carries political risk at home and diplomatic risk abroad. Instead, outcomes are attributed to local forces, intelligence cooperation, or internal developments. British involvement remains implied, never stated. The third category is what might be best described as anticipatory action. These are operations conducted not in response to an overt crisis, but to prevent one from becoming public in the first place. Disrupting networks, deterring specific actors, or quietly reinforcing fragile security arrangements can eliminate the need for visible intervention later. When these operations succeed, there is nothing to announce. The absence of an event becomes the outcome. This is where British secrecy becomes more effective, and most frustrating for anyone trying to document it. There is no incident to point to, no battle to analyze, no failure that forces disclosure. The record shows calm where instability was expected, and the explanation stops there. Occasionally, these sideways operations become visible when something adjacent draws attention. A legal challenge forces partial disclosure. A parliamentary inquiry references assistance provided by UK personnel. A foreign official speaks too freely and creates a diplomatic problem that must then be walked back. Even then, the response is consistent. Details are neither confirmed nor corrected. The government does not rush to clarify, because clarification would itself create a record. This method relies heavily on discipline, both institutional and individual. British Special Forces personnel are trained not just to operate discreetly, but to think in terms of long-term consequences. A single confirmed operation can reshape public expectations and invite scrutiny of others. Silence preserves continuity. It also reshapes how history is written. Unlike conflicts where operations can be reconstructed through declassified documents and official histories, British Special Forces activity often has to be inferred from context. Analysts look for sudden shifts in local capability, changes in security posture, or unexplained reversals of fortune. Patterns emerge, but specifics remain elusive. This ambiguity is often mistaken for myth-making, as if the lack of detail invites exaggeration. In reality, the opposite is true. The system is designed to prevent individual actions from becoming stories at all. There is no incentive to embellish when there is no public platform to receive the embellishment. The result is a body of operations that are known to have occurred without ever being clearly described. They exist sideways, visible only through their effects, never through official acknowledgement. This is not a failure of transparency. It is the outcome of a deliberate choice to treat certain actions as functional necessities rather than historical events. In that framework, the absence of detail is not an omission to be corrected later. It is the final state. No part of British Special Forces history remains as tightly constrained or as legally sensitive as Northern Ireland. Decades after the violence subsided, the files are still closed, the language still careful, and the rules around disclosure still unusually strict. This is not inertia, it is maintenance. What makes Northern Ireland different is not simply that British forces operated on British soil. It is that those operations unfolded inside a legal, political, and moral environment that never fully resolved itself. The conflict ended, the consequences did not. During the period known as the Troubles, the British state faced an insurgency that was domestic, persistent, and deeply entangled with intelligence work. Conventional military solutions were neither appropriate nor sustainable. What emerged instead was an intelligence-led counterinsurgency model that blurred the boundaries between law enforcement, military action, and covert surveillance. British Special Forces were part of that system, not as headline actors, but as specialized tools applied selectively and quietly. Their roles emphasized surveillance support, intelligence integration, and disruption rather than large-scale kinetic action. That distinction matters because it explains why so much remains officially undiscussed. Unlike overseas conflicts, Northern Ireland produced an extensive legal record. Arrests led to trials, trials led to appeals, appeals led to inquests and civil actions decades later. Every official acknowledgement creates potential exposure to soldiers, to commanders, and to the government itself. That legal environment still exists. Cases continue to surface, families seek answers, courts review historical actions through modern standards. In that context, silence is not just a security measure, it is a form of risk containment. A confirmed detail can reopen settled cases or create new ones. An unconfirmed one cannot. There is also the political dimension. The peace process that culminated in the Good Friday Agreement was built on compromise, restraint, and selective forgetting. Not everything that happened was resolved. Some things were deliberately left unexamined so that progress could continue. Reopening the operational record of British Special Forces in Northern Ireland risks destabilizing that balance. It would not simply clarify history, it would force renewed debate over responsibility, legitimacy, and proportionality in a conflict where consensus was never complete. This is why even discussions of intelligence and surveillance remain guarded. British counterinsurgency methods developed in Northern Ireland influenced doctrine worldwide, but the specifics are rarely attributed directly. Techniques are discussed in abstract terms, lessons are generalized, attribution is avoided. From an institutional perspective, Northern Ireland represents a boundary condition. It is the clearest example of why permanent secrecy exists at all. Overseas operations may eventually be acknowledged when circumstances change. Domestic covert action, tied to unresolved political agreements, may never be. This does not mean nothing can be said. The broad contours are understood. Intelligence fusion was central. Surveillance drove operations. Arrests and disruption were often prioritized over visible force. But the mechanics, who did what, when, and under whose authority, remain largely inaccessible. Importantly, this silence is not primarily about protecting individual soldiers. While anonymity matters, the larger concern is systemic. Acknowledging specific operations risks reframing the entire conflict in ways that neither side is prepared to revisit. As a result, Northern Ireland functions as a quiet warning inside British defense culture. It is the case study that reinforces restraint elsewhere. If actions taken decades ago can still carry legal and political weight today, then discretion becomes not just prudent, but essential. This is why references to British Special Forces in Northern Ireland tend to be indirect, cautious, and incomplete. It is why official histories sidestep detail, and it is why the subject remains uncomfortable, even for those inclined towards transparency. The conflict may be over, but the settlement depends, in part, on what remains unsaid. That is the line that still holds, and the reason it is unlikely to be crossed. British Special Forces are often described as being deployed overseas, but that word carries assumptions that do not always apply. Deployment suggests visibility, rotation schedules, and clearly defined theaters of operation. British practice is more ambiguous by design. A more accurate description is presence. British Special Forces personnel frequently operate abroad in statuses that are intentionally difficult to categorize. They may be listed as advisors, trainers, liaison officers, or technical specialists. In practice, those roles can expand or contract rapidly depending on circumstances on the ground. The distinction between observing, advising, and acting is not fixed, it is situational. This flexibility allows British forces to move quietly into environments where overt military involvement would be politically sensitive or diplomatically unacceptable. Training missions become footholds. Liaison roles become access points. Intelligence sharing becomes operational collaboration. This is not a legacy of empire, despite how it is sometimes portrayed. It is a product of scale and constraint. Britain does not have the manpower or political tolerance for sustained, high-visibility interventions. What it does have is a long-standing network of relationships, military, intelligence, and diplomatic, that allow it to influence events without formal escalation. In many regions, British Special Forces presence is deliberately understated even to allies. Units may operate under multinational frameworks where attribution is blurred. Personnel may be embedded within partner forces or joint task elements where their national identity is secondary to function. This creates a paradox. British Special Forces are globally active, yet rarely associated with specific operations. Their influence is often felt through changes in capability rather than through visible action. Local forces improve, intelligence flows more efficiently, security conditions stabilize without an obvious external catalyst. When this works, it attracts little attention. Success is measured in continuity, not spectacle. The quiet presence also allows Britain to operate across legal and political thresholds that would otherwise be restrictive. A formal deployment requires parliamentary scrutiny, public justification, and defined objectives. An advisory or liaison presence does not. It can be adjusted, expanded, or withdrawn with minimal public process. This does not mean these operations lack oversight. They are tightly controlled within government, but that control is exercised internally rather than through public debate. Decisions are made quickly, often in response to intelligence that loses value if delayed. There is also a cultural element. British Special Forces place a premium on integration rather than dominance. The goal is not to replace local capability, but to shape it. This often means working behind the scenes, allowing local actors to take credit, while British involvement remains invisible. That invisibility is not accidental. Public association with foreign operations can undermine the legitimacy of local forces, especially in environments where foreign influence is politically toxic. Silence protects the partner as much as it protects Britain. Over time, this approach has created a distinctive footprint. British Special Forces are most active in places where public acknowledgement would be most damaging. Fragile states, politically divided societies, or regions where overt Western military presence would inflame tensions. The trade-off is that these efforts rarely enter the historical record in a clear way. Analysts can trace outcomes, but not mechanisms. Improvement occurs without attribution. Failures are absorbed quietly, often corrected without explanation. This makes the global quiet presence difficult to quantify and easy to misunderstand. From the outside, it can appear inconsistent or opportunistic. In reality, it is calculated strategy shaped by limited resources and high political sensitivity. British Special Forces do not seek to dominate battlefields. They seek to influence trajectories. That requires patience, discretion, and a willingness to remain uncredited. In a system built on plausible deniability, presence matters more than proclamation. And the less visible that presence is, the more effective it tends to be. Most classified material is sealed with an implied expiration date. Time passes, sensitivities fade, and eventually documents are released, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with redactions, but released all the same. British Special Forces operations do not always follow that pattern. Some files are not waiting for the right moment. They are closed permanently. The reason is not mystery or embarrassment, it's continuity. Many British Special Forces methods are not tied to a single conflict or era. They persist because they work. Surveillance techniques, recruitment pipelines, intelligence sharing arrangements, and operational relationships evolve, but they do not disappear. Disclosing how something was done 30 or 40 years ago can still compromise how it's done today. This alone is enough to justify long-term classification, but it is not the only factor. Foreign intelligence partnerships are another. British operations often rely on cooperation with services that operate under very different political and legal constraints. Some partners cannot afford public association with certain actions at any point, past, present, or future. Disclosure would not just expose British involvement, it would implicate others who never agreed to be named. Once those relationships are established, they become self-protecting. Revealing past cooperation risks damaging future access. In intelligence work, trust is cumulative and fragile. Governments remember who kept their secrets and who did not. There is also the issue of legal precedent. Acknowledging an operation does not simply clarify history, it establishes a benchmark. Once a government admits it acted in a certain way under certain authorities, it invites scrutiny of every similar action that followed. Courts, journalists, and oversight bodies can draw lines that were previously blurred. For British Special Forces, that risk is magnified by the ambiguity deliberately built into their operating model. Many actions sit near the edges of existing legal frameworks. They are authorized, but often under flexible interpretations designed to allow rapid response. Publicly defining these interpretations would narrow them. Then there are diplomatic consequences that do not expire. Some operations affected political outcomes that remain sensitive. Borders changed, governments fell or survived. Exposing the mechanisms behind those outcomes would reopen old grievances and invite new ones. Even decades later, those revelations can destabilize relationships that Britain still depends on. This is why some files remain sealed, not because they are explosive, but because they are still relevant. There is a tendency to assume that classification hides wrongdoing. In reality, permanent secrecy is often applied to actions that were effective, legal under the standards of the time, and aligned with national policy, but which could be difficult to explain without context that no longer exists or cannot be shared. British governments are also acutely aware of comparison. Once one operation is disclosed, pressure builds to disclose others. Each release creates expectations. By maintaining a hard line, Britain avoids the incremental erosion of secrecy that has characterized other systems. This does not mean nothing is ever revealed. Broad outlines emerge, lessons are abstracted, doctrine is discussed in general terms. What is withheld are the connective details that would allow reconstruction. For historians, this is unsatisfying. For policymakers, it is protective. The reality is that some operations will never be acknowledged because acknowledging them would reduce Britain's ability to act in the future. The cost of transparency would be operational relevance. In a system built on discretion, that cost is considered too high. So the files remain closed. Not waiting, not forgotten, finished. British Special Forces do not leave behind the kind of history people expect. There are no official timelines to follow, no comprehensive accounts waiting to be unsealed, no moment where everything is finally explained. What exists instead is absence. Absence created deliberately, maintained consistently, and defended long after the operations themselves ended. Not because the actions were insignificant, but because acknowledging them would still carry consequences, legal, diplomatic, and political. Some stories stay buried because they failed. Others stay buried because they worked. That distinction matters. So when you reach the end of the record and find nothing there, it is not a gap waiting to be filled by speculation. It is the final state of the system. British Special Forces were never meant to be understood through public history. They were meant to be effective and then disappear. And in that silence, the policy still holds. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.